Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly a millennium to the muddy lanes and simple huts of a medieval village. You wake before the sun, not to the soft chirping of birds amplified by your phone alarm, but to the scratchy crow of a rooster somewhere just over the thatched roof. Your feet find the cold, uneven straw mat, and the chill sneaks up your legs as you push yourself to stand. You probably won't survive this if you're used to beds that sigh with memory foam. But let's pretend you're tougher than modern luxuries allow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious whether it's still night or if your sunrise has already started its lazy crawl across your sky. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside, the cold biting and the smell of damp earth wraps around you. Your neighbors' huts sit close together, their roofs stitched with straw like a rough patchwork quilt. Chickens scuttle underfoot, occasionally pecking your toes if you're not careful, and somewhere, a pig grunts in protest. You take a deep breath and notice the river mist curling above the fields beyond the village edge. The dew glints on scattered reeds and patches of green, each blade heavy with moisture. Historians still argue whether villages were originally designed for defense or simply because people preferred to stay near one another, but right now, it doesn't matter. You're awake, and the day is demanding your attention. Your first chore is usually fetching water from the village well. And if you've ever thought a morning commute was tedious, try hauling a wooden bucket through mud that sticks like thick soup. The rope smells of mildew, and the pulley creaks in complaint. The well water isn't crystal clear, but you've learned to ignore the little scum floating on the surface. It doesn't taste so different from what you remember. Sometimes someone drops in a bit of grain or a coin, and the village children jump and squeal, chasing the ripples across the surface. Fringe tales claim that some wells were enchanted, capable of reflecting the future in their dark depths, though most scholars dismiss this as rumor or the product of boredom. Still, as you peer into the water, the shadowed reflection of your own face stirs an odd sense of wonder, like a private pre-dawn mirror showing more than just your eyes. The air smells strongly of livestock, goats, cows, and the occasional mule that complains loudly as it shooed from its favorite patch of grass. You greet your neighbors in soft nods, a murmur of good morning passing between breathless chores. One of the village women juggles a basket of eggs, carefully stepping over stray clumps of mud, and you can't help a small smile at her concentration. These are your first lessons in social navigation. Avoid breaking eggs, avoid stepping in cow pies, and above all, remember who owes whom a favor or a handful of salt. Even before the sun rises, the microeconomy of village life hums quietly, like a spider weaving its invisible web around every interaction. You move toward your plot of land, barefoot or in rough leather shoes, feeling the uneven soil beneath your toes. Every step is a sensory map of yesterday's rain and last week's plowing. You notice the way the earth crumbles, its aroma rich and almost sweet. If you ignore the manure added for fertilization, some historians still argue whether medieval peasants understood crop rotation beyond simple trial and error. But the patterns they follow instinctively suggest a subtle wisdom. Beans after wheat, barley after oats, soil rested under clover. You admire the rhythm as if it were music only your hands can play. And then there's the chill in your bones that no sun can warm yet, reminding you why medieval peasants often started their day hunched, shoulders tight, and fingers stiff. A fringe tidbit: some villagers applied a mixture of lard and ashes to hands to prevent frostbite, a practice historians love to note with amused horror. You try it once, the ash sticking stubbornly to the skin. But it's better than losing fingers entirely, so you repeat the ritual mechanically, like a mantra for survival. The village slowly stirs as more people emerge. Men carry yokes of water or bundles of wood, while women balance milk pails, baskets of grain, or small children who whimper at the chill. You remember your own childhood, only slightly different. The smell of fresh bread was rare, not daily. The only music was the wind through reeds or the lowing of cattle. You trudge past a chicken coop, and one particularly bold hen decides your leg is a convenient perch. You yelp, half laughing, half annoyed, and it flaps off, leaving muddy footprints as evidence of its rebellion. Somewhere a bell clinks, signaling that the town crier is ready to deliver messages, announcements, or warnings. You half ignore it, used to the constant hum of daily survival rather than grand news. Still, it marks the rhythm of the morning. Fetch water, tend animals, prepare for the day's labor. Historians still argue whether peasants ever paid much attention to official announcements, or if they filtered them through the gossip of neighbors to make sense of life. You notice that even small details, a goat bleating oddly, a bundle of herbs tied on a fence, can carry messages that outsiders might miss entirely. By the time the sun begins to lift above the horizon, its rays warm your damp shoulders and paint the straw roofs gold. You pause for a moment, savoring that brief, almost cinematic pause before the day accelerates into work, chores, and errands. A cheeky thought crosses your mind. Even a medieval peasant could have appreciated the luxury of a slow coffee. Yet here you are, grinding your morning sustenance with nothing but willpower and an old wooden pestle. And so, as you trudge back toward the center of the village, balancing water, dodging chickens, and feeling mud squish between toes, you realize that dawn in a medieval village isn't just a time, it's a sensory immersion, a quiet prelude to a day measured in labor, minor triumphs, and the occasional oddity that keeps life interesting. Remember the chill, the damp, the strange reflections in the well. And that stubborn hint, these small details will shape how you remember every medieval morning to come. You trudge back toward the small, low-slung hut you call home, feeling the early morning chill fade as the sun begins to stretch its light across the village. The smell of damp earth still clings to your boots. And somewhere, a goat is attempting to climb a stack of firewood, as if gravity were merely a suggestion. You reach the doorway and pause, taking in the simple interior. Rough wooden beams, a hearth of blackened stone, and the faint scent of yesterday's stew lingering in the corners. Breakfast isn't a lavish affair. It never is. You scoop up a piece of coarse bread, its crust thick and a little burned on one edge, and nibble it alongside a chunk of salted cheese. The flavor is humble, plain, but sustains you enough to face the hours ahead. While you chew, you glance out the window and notice your neighbors preparing their own morning meals. One woman stirs a pot over a small fire, adding herbs you don't recognize, muttering to herself. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had consistent access to spices beyond salt. But a pinch of rosemary or sage could brighten even the humblest stew. You swallow your bite and consider the oddities that peppered daily life here. Fringe accounts tell of peasants secretly fermenting beverages in small crocks hidden under straw, though whether this was widespread or merely whispered rumor is unclear. You smirk. Some things, you think, haven't changed so much in 1,000 years. Breakfast is punctuated by the soft clatter of wooden spoons and the occasional squawk of chickens pressed too close to the cooking area. You share a nod with the neighbor across the yard, whose child is trying to sneak a bite of bread before anyone notices. The simple act of eating together becomes a ritual, a communal rhythm. And the conversations that drift between houses aren't just chatter. They're a subtle exchange of news, favors, and small debts. Some scholars debate whether peasants truly had time for leisure before the day's chores. But these moments suggest that even in the humblest homes, life had pauses, moments of quiet attention and shared humanity. After your meal, you might venture to the village square if you have anything to trade or sell. The path is already alive with movement. Carts rattling over cobblestones, livestock tugging at their tethers, and neighbors balancing bundles of wool, eggs, or vegetables. You catch snippets of gossip as you pass. The baker's apprentice has burned yet another batch of bread. The blacksmith's new horse has taken to bolting across the yard. And a traveling peddler promises charms for warding off misfortune. Historians still debate whether peasants truly traveled beyond their villages often, but the market, even if just a short walk away, becomes a stage for exchange, information, and occasionally spectacle. You stop to inspect a neighbor's basket of eggs, weighing them carefully in your hands. Each one is slightly different in size, shape, and color, an intentional testament to nature's variety. You haggle gently, offering a handful of grain in exchange. The merchant frowns, then nods, a silent understanding passing between you. Bartering is an art here, a daily negotiation that balances practicality with social grace. Fringe stories suggest that some traders would leave tiny charms among goods to protect themselves from bad luck or dishonest customers, though whether anyone took these seriously is hard to confirm. Breakfast aside, the early hours are filled with preparation. You grind a little flour for later, skim the cream from yesterday's milk, and arrange firewood near the hearth. The domestic rhythm is methodical and oddly soothing, the repetitive motions, the familiar scents, the small triumphs of organization in a world that otherwise demands constant vigilance. A stray cat rubs against your legs, its purrs vibrating through the wooden floor, reminding you that even animals have their own way of negotiating this daily world. At this point, you might notice minor skirmishes of routine. One neighbor's goat attempts to scale a fence, while another child, bold or foolish, balances precariously on the edge of the well. You intervene or ignore depending on how pressing the task at hand is, recognizing that the micro-chaos of the village is both hazard and entertainment. Historians still argue whether peasants were more attentive to their neighbors, activities out of necessity or genuine curiosity. But there's no denying that this constant observation strengthens social bonds. You chuckle quietly to yourself as the goat retreats, clearly unimpressed by human authority. The morning meal sometimes serves as a mini reprieve, an opportunity to connect before the fields claim most of your day. Neighbors might lean over fences to share a joke, or someone will lean on a stick and recount an anecdote about last year's harvest. You notice the subtle gestures, the body language of familiarity, and the rhythm of communal life. Fringe accounts mention secret rituals tied to meals, throwing a pinch of salt over a shoulder to ward off envy or whispering wishes to boiling water, but whether these were common or merely eccentric superstitions is unclear. Still, they add color to the otherwise muted palette of daily survival. Once breakfast is complete, chores await. You refill the water pail for livestock, scrub a few scuffed pots, and organize the small stores of grain or root vegetables. Each action is deliberate, shaped by necessity, and executed with the understanding that missing even a small task can cascade into a larger problem. You notice the sun climbing steadily, its warmth beginning to offset the morning chill. Shadows shorten, illuminating the village square with golden clarity. And as the aroma of slightly toasted bread fades from your hut, you prepare mentally for the next stage, stepping into the fields, where labor becomes a long, continuous dialogue with soil, sky, and season. As you tie your apron or adjust your cloak, you reflect on how breakfast is more than sustenance. It's a marker of continuity, a morning ritual anchoring you to a community, a space and a rhythm that stretches far beyond your immediate tasks. Even the simplest bread, the salted cheese, and the shared nods of acknowledgement form a tiny network of reassurance, a reminder that you are part of a living, breathing village world. And with that quiet understanding, you take your first steps toward the fields, the market, or whatever labor the day demands, carrying the warmth of a modest meal and the gentle chatter of neighbors as invisible companions. The fields await, sprawling beyond the last cluster of cottages, their edges softened by mist and the early warmth of the sun. You step into the familiar rhythm of soil underfoot, the leather of your shoes stiff and damp from morning chores, and feel the weight of your tools, wood and hoe, pitchfork, or spade balanced in your hands like an extension of yourself. The air smells of tilled earth, wet grass, and the faint, tangy hint of manure, which, despite your better instincts, you know is essential for keeping crops alive. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly understood crop rotation scientifically, or simply relied on empirical trial and error. But either way, the results feed entire villages year after year. You kneel, sinking fingers into the soft ground, feeling clumps of soil give way beneath your touch. This tactile connection to the land is almost hypnotic. The way the dirt clings, the subtle differences between dry and damp patches, and the occasional worm wriggling free in protest. Fringe accounts suggest some villagers believed worms were little spirits helping the soil, though most of your contemporaries probably just shrugged and moved on. The work is physically demanding. Your back aches, arms strain, and sweat beads along your hairline, but there's a meditative quality to it. It's an intimate conversation between you and the earth. As you sow seeds, your mind wanders, tracking the patterns of sun, wind, and rain. You notice the small miracles: a single blade of wheat poking through last week's soil, the steady trickle of water along a furrow, or the way certain weeds stubbornly return despite repeated efforts. You pause to pull a particularly resilient dandelion, grimacing at its tenacity. You recall hearing that some plants were believed to harbor protective spirits or good luck charms if left untouched. Fringe beliefs that linger in whispers. Across the village, you smile, acknowledging that part of your day blends the practical and the mystical, whether you like it or not. Around mid-morning, other peasants drift into the fields. Their presence, a soft chorus of shuffling boots, occasional laughter, and murmured greetings. Children might be sent to fetch water or chase stray chickens, their tiny voices blending with the rhythm of labor. You notice how bodies bend and shift, the subtle ways hands grip tools, and how every movement is honed by repetition. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had formal techniques for plowing and planting, or if most knowledge passed through observation and trial. But watching your neighbors, you realize that centuries of collective experience create an almost choreographed efficiency. Occasionally, the monotony is punctuated by surprises. A hawk swoops low over the field, startling chickens into frantic flight. A sudden gust of wind rattles the branches at the field's edge. Or you stumble upon a patch of wild herbs previously unnoticed, their fragrance sharp and intoxicating. Fringe tales suggest certain herbs can ward off ill fortune, protect crops, or even heal a sick child if used just right. Though, naturally, results are inconsistent. You pocket a sprig of one, if only to honor the tradition, not expecting miracles, but appreciating the ritualistic comfort it provides. You pause to drink from a leather flask, the cool water offering a brief relief from exertion. Your muscles hum with exertion, but the steady rhythm of hoeing, planting, or weeding becomes a kind of meditation. Sweat glistens along your neck and forehead, catching sunlight and tiny, fleeting rainbows. And you notice the birds in the trees, chirping and circling, oblivious to human toil. Some historians still debate whether peasants paid much attention to the natural world or simply reacted to it out of necessity but moments. Like this listening to the subtle orchestra of life around you, you suggest a quiet awareness that's both practical and reflective. The land itself offers small rewards and reminders. If you find a particularly large potato or an unusually firm root, feeling a brief surge of pride. Children passing by glance at your work, and neighbors offer casual compliments or teasing remarks about how slowly you labor. Humor has a strange way of entering even the hardest work. A goat might try to nibble at your boot, a crow snatches a shiny object from a cart, or someone slips in the mud, prompting a wave of quiet laughter. These small episodes punctuate the long day, reminding you that life in the fields isn't purely hardship, it's a blend of effort, observation, and shared experience. As the sun climbs higher, the work intensifies. You alternate between digging furrows, planting seeds, and removing stubborn weeds, your hands forming a silent dialogue with the soil. Historians still argue whether peasants had specialized techniques for maximizing yield, but you rely on instinct honed over years of labor. Every movement is economical. A turn of the wrist, a shift of weight, a small adjustment of grip that keeps the day from becoming unbearable. Fringe stories claim that some peasants whispered to seeds as they planted them, believing it encouraged growth. Whether this had any effect or simply added comfort, you indulged the habit briefly, smiling at the absurdity and charm. By late morning, fatigue settles into your muscles, and the warmth of the sun begins to weigh pleasantly on your shoulders. You take a brief break, stretching and leaning against the handle of your hoe. The village in the distance hums with the early energy of people tending to chores, selling eggs, or running errands. You watch as smoke curls from chimneys, the scent of cooking mingling with the fertile smell of freshly turned soil. A minor debate passes through your mind. Historians still argue whether peasant communities were tightly coordinated in their labor or more loosely structured. But from where you stand, there's a sense of rhythm, an unspoken agreement about who does what and when. And then, almost imperceptibly, you notice the time slipping by. The morning has stretched and compressed simultaneously, each hour blending into the next as you work. The sun is high now, but your attention is absorbed in the tactile, immediate demands of the field. You wipe sweat from your brow, feeling the texture of dirt under your fingernails and the ache in your shoulders as a kind of badge, a tangible record of labor. A stray thought enters. Perhaps this is what freedom feels like for a medieval peasant, not the absence of toil, but the quiet mastery of rhythm, endurance, and the small, tangible outcomes of a day well spent. By the time you step back, surveying the neat rows of freshly turned soil or newly planted seeds, a sense of accomplishment warms you more than the sun ever could. You've coaxed life from the ground, participated in centuries of collective human knowledge. And for a few hours, you've been both observer and participant in a world that moves slowly but surely. Remember the rhythm, the sweat, the brief amusements, and the tiny miracles of the soil. The day is only beginning. And yet, in these hours of toil, you've already become part of the story of medieval labor. Between one furrow and the next, your eyes wander, and the field seems alive with oddities you might never notice in the rush of daily chores. A cow stands unusually still near the edge of the barley, almost as if it's watching you, head tilted in quiet judgment. You pause, unsure whether to scold it or simply admire the moment. Fringe tales in the village whisper that certain animals carry omens. A cow nodding might predict rain. A black bird darting erratically could signal misfortune. You chuckle softly, reminding yourself that superstition and routine are often intertwined. And that belief, even half-hearted, gives structure to a life otherwise dominated by labor. As you bend to pull weeds or scatter seeds, the wind carries a mixture of scents. The sharp tang of herbs growing at the field edge, the earthy smell of wet soil, and the faint smoke from distant hearths. You notice that a neighbor has cultivated an eccentric garden plot nearby, filled with strange shapes of vegetables and herbs whose uses remain mysterious to outsiders. Some historians still argue whether such eccentricity was common or simply the romanticized imagination of later chroniclers. But it doesn't matter today. It provides a moment of amusement and distraction. You smile, imagining the stories that might arise from these tiny pockets of individuality amid otherwise uniform fields. A sudden flutter draws your attention to a scarecrow. Fashioned from a patched cloak and straw, standing with arms outstretched like a tiny sentinel, you wonder how effective it really is. Crows seem largely unimpressed. Fringe sources suggest that scarecrows were sometimes imbued with charms to ward off evil spirits. Not just birds, a testament to the blending of practicality and superstition. You shrug, returning to your work, appreciating both the human ingenuity and the playful irrationality that pervades everyday life. There's a strange comfort in knowing that effort, ritual, and imagination coexist seamlessly here. Your gaze shifts to the neighboring field, where someone is tending a small herd of goats. They seem to move with uncanny coordination, as if aware of a rhythm only humans can faintly perceive. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly managed their herds with formal techniques or relied on intuition honed over generations. Watching the careful choreography of herder and animals, you sense the answer lies somewhere in between, a practical art refined through experience rather than formal instruction. The goats occasionally nibble at stray leaves or a low branch. They're chewing a soft, repetitive soundtrack against the backdrop of your labor. Odd details continue to punctuate your day. A curious neighbor appears, balancing a basket of unusually colored eggs, and recounts a tale of a chicken that supposedly laid golden speckled eggs. You suppress a laugh, nod politely, and listen as the story grows in the telling, becoming more elaborate with each retelling. Fringe accounts suggest such animals were rare omens or blessed creatures, though reality probably lies closer to simple genetic mutations or accidental discoloration. Nevertheless, you enjoy the storytelling, the mingling of wonder, disbelief, and gossip is a central part of village life, shaping the texture of daily existence as much as soil and weather. The morning heat grows stronger, and sweat dampens your brow and hair. You pause, wiping your face with a rag, the coarse fibers scratching lightly against your skin. There's a faint sweetness in the air, the subtle aroma of wildflowers mingling with the more pungent smells of livestock and soil. You notice insects, flies buzzing lazily near your hands, a dragonfly glinting in the sunlight. Take a moment to appreciate these smaller details. Historians still debate whether peasants were largely oblivious to such minutiae, or if attentiveness to small environmental cues was essential for survival. But for you, observing these tiny creatures adds a quiet layer of engagement to labor otherwise dominated by brute effort. A soft laugh drifts across the field as a neighbor's child attempts to catch a chicken that's decided to escape its pen. You glance over, recognizing the blend of frustration, amusement, and teaching that threads through village life. These moments, seemingly trivial, reinforce community bonds and maintain a shared rhythm. Fringe accounts suggest some children were tasked with watching over animals at night, guided by whispered stories of witches or protective spirits. You shake your head gently, recalling the whispered warnings from your own childhood, and feel a subtle comfort in these inherited rituals, no matter how improbable. Midday approaches, and the sun climbs higher, casting long, narrow shadows between the rows of crops. You pause briefly to drink from a small water skin, its leather soft and worn from repeated use. The water tastes faintly of metal from the container, yet quenches thirst in a way nothing else can. You feel the heat pressing against your back, the steady hum of insects and distant animal calls forming a backdrop to your thoughts. Some historians argue that medieval peasants were largely at the mercy of weather patterns, but your own instincts, honed by years of observation, allow you to anticipate shifts in wind, clouds, and the behavior of animals, giving you a subtle control over your environment. You notice a peculiar plant at the edge of the field, its leaves shiny and oddly patterned. Some villagers claim it has medicinal properties, capable of curing minor ailments if brewed correctly. Others insist it's poisonous. You harvest a few leaves cautiously, thinking perhaps this is the sort of knowledge that separates a prudent peasant from one who simply suffers consequences. Fringe lore sometimes ties such plants to fairy stories or protective charms, and though you remain skeptical, the thrill of discovery adds spice to an otherwise methodical day. The day continues in its steady, hypnotic cadence, hoeing, planting, observing, pausing for small diversions and noting oddities that otherwise would escape notice. The connection between labor, environment, and superstition is seamless, an unspoken code guiding each motion. A stray thought enters. In this constant interplay of toil, observation, and small amusements, you are both participant and witness, shaping the land while absorbing its lessons. And as the sun arcs across the sky, warming your shoulders and illuminating the field in golden light, you realize that the peculiarities, cows that nod, herbs that promise magic, children chasing chickens aren't distractions. They are the textures of daily medieval life. The odd but essential flourishes that make each day memorable and rich with subtle wonder. By the time you reach the edge of the village, the market is beginning to stir with a low, vibrant hum. The clatter of wooden carts, the cries of merchants hawking eggs, wool, and pottery, and the occasional bleat of a goat form a symphony of controlled chaos. You step carefully over uneven cobblestones and stray straw, aware that a misplaced foot could send a basket of goods tumbling. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were strictly regulated by local authorities or operated in a semi-chaotic, customary way, but from your vantage, the system works, however informal it may appear. The stalls are a visual feast, each offering an assortment of colors, shapes, and textures. You pass baskets of eggs, their shells speckled in pale browns and creams, and sacks of grain with tiny wisps escaping into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Wool is stacked high, sometimes dyed in muted shades, sometimes left natural, the rough fibers tickling your hands as you finger the textures. Fringe tales claim some merchants hide charms and goods to protect against theft or bad luck. And though you've never caught anyone in the act, the possibility makes browsing the stalls slightly more thrilling. You stop at a cart selling small tools, knives, and pins. The merchant greets you with a nod, a familiar glint of humor in his eye. "Looking for trouble, or just fixing fences today?" he asks. You smile faintly, weighing a small sickle in your hand. It's surprisingly light, balanced in a way that suggests careful craftsmanship. Scholars debate whether peasants manufactured their own tools entirely, or if these items were primarily purchased from itinerant smiths, but the answer seems to vary village by village. You decide this one is worth the grain you offer in exchange, shaking hands and feeling a small surge of satisfaction. Around you, children dart between stalls, sometimes chasing chickens or attempting to lift small objects they shouldn't. Their laughter is a high-pitched counterpoint to the low murmur of barter and negotiation. You notice a woman with a basket of herbs speaking in hushed tones to a passerby, whispering what might be advice, gossip, or charm instructions. Fringe accounts suggest herbal knowledge was often closely guarded, passed from mother to daughter or through secretive apprenticeships. You glance at the herbs, noting the pungent smells of sage, rosemary, and something faintly metallic, and tuck a small sprig of mint into your pocket, both for later cooking and as a nod to the subtle magic woven into daily life. The market is also a theater of social interaction. You overhear neighbors whispering about livestock sales, upcoming church festivals, and the latest gossip from the Lord's manor. Even mundane transactions, bartering a bushel of wheat for a few eggs, carry a social dimension, a way of maintaining relationships and asserting reputation. Historians still argue whether peasants truly followed rigid social hierarchies in such spaces, or if markets allowed moments of subtle subversion. But you can see both in action. Respect, negotiation, and small tests of skill and patience intermingling freely. You stop briefly to watch a peddler unpack a trunk of colorful beads and trinkets. Children cluster around, eyes wide with fascination, some daring to reach out and touch the bright, shiny pieces. Fringe stories tell of peddlers being sorcerers or carriers of fortune, trading not just goods, but luck, advice, or even curses. You raise an eyebrow, amused, but cannot deny the thrill of these small, unpredictable encounters. They remind you that the market is more than commerce. It is a stage for storytelling, play, and the subtle weaving of community bonds. A man nearby demonstrates a small hand-cranked mill, grinding grain with astonishing speed. You marvel at the technique, noting the careful rhythm and coordination required to operate it efficiently. Some historians still debate whether peasants had access to such devices widely, or if they were restricted to wealthier villagers or communal workshops. Either way, you're grateful for the demonstration, imagining the time saved, the labor lightened, and the minor luxury of efficiency in an otherwise exhausting day. As you continue to navigate the market, you encounter familiar faces, exchanging jokes, friendly jabs, and small favors. One neighbor hands over a tiny piece of cloth, claiming it's the last remnant of a family weaving project. You nod appreciatively, understanding that even small gestures hold weight in a community bound by interdependence. Fringe accounts suggest such exchanges were sometimes charged with symbolic meaning, protective intent, or subtle competition. You tuck the cloth away carefully, noting how each interaction contributes to the village's invisible web of trust, obligation, and camaraderie. Food stalls draw your attention next. You inhale the faint aroma of freshly baked bread, mingled with the earthy tang of root vegetables roasting over open fires. You consider buying a small portion, just enough to carry through the next part of the day. Historians still debate whether peasants regularly bought prepared food or relied solely on home-prepared meals. But the sight, sound, and smell of these stalls provide a lively counterpoint to your morning labor. You catch the vendor smiling as you taste a tiny morsel, savoring the subtle sweetness, the warmth against your teeth, and the brief comfort it offers before returning to toil. Finally, the market begins to wind down, merchants packing up, children reluctantly dragged away, and the rhythmic clatter of carts slowing to a stop. You gather your own small acquisitions, herbs, a modest bundle of wool, and make your way back through the village streets, noticing how life continues its gentle pulse despite the fading bustle. The exchange of goods, gossip, and small stories has reinforced your place in the community, reminded you of the human capacity for humor, creativity, and ritual, even under the strain of daily labor. And as you step past the final stalls, you carry the quiet satisfaction of having participated fully in this microcosm of medieval life, ready to return to the hearth, the stew, and the domestic rhythms that await. You return home with a sense of quiet accomplishment, the small bundle of goods swinging lightly at your side, and the smell of herbs and bread mingling with the lingering sense of the field. It's cold. When you left, now waits like a silent companion, a patch of potential warmth and comfort. You arrange the firewood, some from your morning chores, and some scavenged from neighbors' abandoned stacks, carefully stacking each piece so that air will circulate and the flames will grow predictably. A stray cat stretches across the floor, its purr vibrating faintly through the hut, a soft accompaniment to your domestic rhythm. Lighting the fire is a skill, deceptively simple yet demanding attention. Sparks catch on dry kindling, smoke curls in lazy spirals, and after a few anxious moments, small flames leap confidently to life. You add larger logs, listening to the satisfying crackle, and adjust the hearth's iron grate to control heat and airflow. Fringe accounts suggest that some peasants whispered to the fire for protection, offering small words of thanks or requests for patience. Though historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or merely anecdotal, you indulge the habit, softly muttering a wish that the stew cooks evenly and the smoke docent tea chase neighbors into the street. Breakfast has faded into memory, replaced by the anticipation of a simple midday meal. You chop root vegetables, their aroma sharp and earthy, and toss them into a simmering pot. A handful of herbs, picked earlier at the market, adds a subtle complexity, the scent rising to mingle with the ever-present smell of hearth smoke. You stir carefully, mindful of timing, and realize that cooking is as much a meditation as field work. Each motion, chopping, stirring, tasting is deliberate, rhythmic, and grounding. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had consistent recipes or relied entirely on improvisation. But the balance of flavors in front of you speaks to practical experience, instinct, and inherited knowledge. While the stew simmers, you attend to minor domestic chores. Pots and pans are scrubbed with coarse brushes, clay vessels inspected for cracks, and wool carefully wound into small, manageable skeins for future use. You notice a neighbor's child peeking through the doorway, curiosity sparkling in wide eyes. You hand the child a small carrot from the pot, and the smile exchanged carries more warmth than the fire itself. Fringe tales suggest that giving food to children at precise moments can influence luck or health, though you accept it mostly as a gesture of goodwill. In this small exchange, the rhythm of communal life pulses quietly alongside your own solitary labor. Meal preparation continues, and the textures, colors, and scents of the ingredients are almost hypnotic. You feel the heat from the fire warming your shoulders, the gentle tension in your hands as you tend the stew, and the subtle aroma of bread baking elsewhere in the village wafting through cracks in the wall. A fly buzzes lazily, unbothered by your work, and a cockerel crows in the distance. These background details, minor and often overlooked, create a layered sensory experience, reminding you that even a simple domestic space is alive with movement, sound, and story. You taste the stew, testing for seasoning and temperature. The combination is modest yet satisfying. Earthy roots softened to just the right consistency, herbs lending depth, and the slight temps of broth holding it all together. Fringe stories suggest that some peasants added tiny, secret ingredients, believing that certain combinations encouraged prosperity or warded off illness. You smile, recognizing that while most of this is superstition, the act itself, a small ritual performed daily, adds meaning to otherwise mundane sustenance. Historians still argue whether peasants believed in such culinary magic or treated it as light amusement, but the sensory comfort is undeniable. Once the meal is nearly ready, you set aside portions for family or neighbors, mindful of tradition and necessity. Sharing food is as important socially as it is practically. It reinforces bonds, acknowledges favors owed or received, and maintains the delicate equilibrium of village life. A neighbor might accept a bowl with a nod, a whispered thanks, or a quiet smile, each small interaction reinforcing the invisible threads that weave the community together. Fringe accounts claim that distributing certain foods at precise times could influence luck, fertility, or harvest success, though you treat these more as charming stories than actionable advice. As you eat, you notice subtle changes in light and sound. The sun has climbed high, casting sharper shadows and illuminating details previously hidden. Birds chatter more vigorously now, insects hum steadily, and the occasional distant clatter signals a cart passing along the main lane. You take a moment to savor both food and observation, realizing that even the most mundane meal is enriched by attention to surroundings, smell, taste, and human connection. Historians still debate whether peasants had true moments of leisure during meals, or whether eating was always a hurried necessity. But for now, you are fully present, immersed in a quiet domestic ritual. After finishing, you clean dishes carefully, rinsing with water drawn earlier and wiping surfaces with rough cloths. Each action is deliberate, shaped by years of repetition, yet there's a sense of satisfaction in maintaining order. You notice a small pile of wool in the corner, destined for spinning or weaving later in the day. Fringe stories suggest that certain times of day were better for spinning or sewing, aligned with the movement of the sun or lunar cycles, though you treat it mostly as guidance rather than rigid rule. Still, timing your tasks brings a comforting sense of structure, a rhythm threading through the otherwise unpredictable flow of village life. Finally, you pause to rest briefly, leaning against the wall, feeling the residual warmth from the hearth and the gentle fatigue settling into your muscles. The domestic labor, while less physically grueling than fieldwork, carries its own demands: attention, patience, and a delicate balance of resources. You sip water from a small flask, listening to the faint murmur of neighbors outside, children's voices drifting through cracks, and the occasional clink of distant tools. The gentle interweaving of sound, smell, and tactile experience forms the quiet backbone of your afternoon. And so, with the hearth warm, the meal enjoyed, and chores tending to both necessity and ritual, you feel a subtle satisfaction. Each motion, stirring, chopping, cleaning, ease, a dialogue with your space, your community, and yourself. The combination of practicality, observation, small domestic enchantments carries you smoothly toward the next stage of the day, ready for the additional labor, minor adventures, and communal moments that will continue to define your medieval life. In these simple, humble actions, you find the quiet artistry of everyday survival, a dance of hands, senses, and small victories that might escape the notice of historians, yet form the lived experience of centuries past. After the midday meal and the comforting rhythm of domestic chores, you step outside once more, this time shifting attention to tasks that extend beyond the fields or the hearth. Roof tiles need mending, fences must be reinforced, and firewood gathered before the afternoon sun loses its edge. The day's labor is a continuum, flowing from one responsibility to the next, each task blending into the last. Fringe tales whisper of villagers performing secret nocturnal craftsdini carvings, charms, or scribbled notes tucked into beams, but most of your efforts remain grounded in practical necessity. Still, the possibility of hidden, quiet artistry adds a faintly magical hue to otherwise ordinary work. You hoist a bundle of firewood onto your back and navigate the uneven village paths, feeling the strain in your shoulders and the comforting weight of purpose. The sun now leans gently toward afternoon, casting longer shadows that shift across walls, fences, and fields. Birds scatter as you pass, startled by the crunch of your boots against gravel and straw. Historians still argue whether peasants had distinct work shifts or simply flowed through tasks as necessity dictated. But your routine suggests an almost intuitive understanding of timing, weather, and energy. You pause briefly to adjust your load, noticing the smell of pine mingling with the tang of manure and the faint smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Repairing fences is a particularly tactile endeavor. You examine each post, probing the wood for weakness, testing ropes and ties, and aligning planks so that animals will remain contained. Fringe accounts claim that some villagers tied small charms to fence posts to protect livestock from misfortune, though such beliefs are inconsistently documented. You find satisfaction in the practical success of the work itself. The planks align, the rope holds, and the herd is secure while mentally filing away the superstition as a whimsical echo of human creativity. The rhythm of hammering, sawing, and adjusting becomes almost meditative, grounding you in the physicality of survival. Next, you turn to the roof, clambering carefully onto the thatched covering. The texture of straw beneath your hands is rough and pliable, responding to pressure with satisfying resistance. You adjust overlapping layers, ensuring that rainwater will flow properly and that the structure retains integrity through storms. Historians still debate how often peasants themselves managed roof repairs versus relying on itinerant thatchers. But your own experience suggests that communal knowledge and shared labor often compensated for lack of formal expertise. Fringe tales suggest that certain rituals performed while mending roofs, like a whispered greeting to the sky, could influence weather, though you mostly find comfort in the routine itself. Gathering herbs or minor crops from village plots occasionally intersects with this maintenance work. You notice the odd shapes of leaves, the faint smell of mint or sage, and the occasional mischief of small animals disrupting carefully tended areas. The combination of labor and observation requires both attentiveness and patience. Fringe accounts suggest that some herbs were believed to absorb the fatigue of those who worked nearby, providing subtle comfort and vitality, though whether this has any real effect is debatable. You tuck a sprig into your bundle, enjoying the scent and the reminder that even small plants carry stories, lore, and utility. As the afternoon progresses, minor accidents and interventions punctuate the work. A plank slips, narrowly missing your foot. A goat ventures too close to a fence under repair. A neighbor calls out a warning, which you acknowledge with a quick nod. These small episodes keep you alert, provide moments of levity, and reinforce the social fabric of the village. Historians still argue whether peasants functioned largely independently in such tasks, or if labor was coordinated more collaboratively. But observation of the present suggests a mixture. Some chores demand solitary focus, others benefit from collective vigilance. The steady progression of labor is interspersed with brief moments of reflection. You glance across the fields, noting the rows of crops, the distant smoke of kitchens, and the occasional fluttering of laundry in a breeze. Fringe accounts suggest that some peasants believed observing daily routines from a quiet distance could influence fortune or protect the home, though the practical benefits are likely more psychological than magical. Still, the pause provides a moment to internalize the day's efforts, to appreciate progress made, and to sense your own place within the broader rhythm of village life. Other villagers move along parallel paths, each immersed in their own tasks, repairing roofs, tending gardens, mending fences, or fetching water. Interactions are brief but meaningful. A nod, a word of caution, a shared joke about stubborn timber or muddy boots. Humor threads through the work, subtly easing the strain of labor. Fringe stories sometimes tell of small competitions who can mend a fence fastest, or gather wood most efficiently, but even in playful rivalry, cooperation underlies every action. Historians still debate the degree of competition versus collaboration, but from your vantage, both coexist naturally, shaping the pace and texture of life. By late afternoon, fatigue sets in a pleasant, earned weariness that sinks into your muscles, tinged with the warmth of the sun still low in the sky. You pause, leaning on a tool, listening to the subtle rhythms of the village, the low murmur of conversation, a distant child laughing, the occasional caw of a crow. The combination of human activity, animal life, and natural sounds forms a comforting acoustic tapestry, grounding you in the shared experience of place and time. Fringe accounts suggest that attentiveness to these rhythms was believed to enhance skill, foresight, or luck, though you appreciate them mostly for the quiet pleasure they bring. Finally, you gather the last bundles of wood, secure the fence one last time, and descend from the roof. Your body is tired, your hands roughened, but there's a satisfying weight in accomplishment. Every repaired plank, every stacked log, every adjusted thatch is tangible evidence of your contribution to the village's ongoing survival. You notice small details along the path home: a rabbit darting through long grass, a neighbor feeding chickens, smoke curling from hearths. Historians still argue whether such workdays were entirely dictated by necessity or allowed for creative expression and observation, but you sense both are present. The practical demands shape the day, yet the small flourishes ritual observation, humor imbue it with texture, memory, and subtle joy. Returning home, you feel the transition from labor to reflection, the satisfaction of having participated fully in a continuum of effort and observation. The mundane, repetitive work carries its own beauty, a rhythm connecting you to neighbors, animals, and the land itself. Fringe beliefs, whether amusing or slightly mystical, offer comfort and context, and even the simplest tasks, stacking firewood, mending a fence, adjusting thatch, become markers of skill, endurance, and presence. And as the sun dips lower, casting long golden shadows across the village, you recognize that these afternoons, filled with labor, minor surprises, and quiet reflection, are as central to medieval life as the fields themselves. Evening descends with a subtle shift in light and temperature. The sun, having begun its slow decline toward the horizon, casts long, golden shadows across the village and fields. You notice the way the light skims across rooftops, highlighting the uneven thatch and casting a warm glow over the cobblestones. A gentle breeze carries the faint scent of smoke, herbs, and damp earth, mingling with the occasional whiff of livestock and fresh bread. Historians still argue whether peasants actively tracked the day's light for efficiency or simply adapted to it instinctively. But you feel both awareness and instinct working in concert as you move through familiar spaces. Your first task is to prepare for the evening meal, a continuation of the domestic rhythm that punctuates the day. You gather fresh water from the well, noting the cool rush as it fills your pail and listening to the faint echoes of voices carried by the evening air. Children's laughter drifts from nearby, a soft counterpoint to the gentle creak of wooden wheels and the low murmur of adults finishing their own chores. Fringe accounts suggest that fetching water at specific times was believed to protect households from bad luck or disease. a superstition that blends neatly with practicality. You smile, knowing that even if the reasoning is fanciful, the task itself is necessary. Once the water is ready, you set about preparing vegetables and grains, the textures and colors forming a quiet palette on the rough wooden table. Potatoes, carrots, and onions are chopped with careful, rhythmic precision, each slice falling neatly into a bowl. You add a handful of herbs picked earlier in the day, their fragrance sharp and soothing, and set a pot to simmer over the hearth's fire. Fringe tales claim that certain herbs, when cooked in the evening, bring protection or clarity in dreams. Though historians still debate the extent to which peasants consciously integrated such practices into their routines. Regardless, the aroma rising from the pot is comforting, a subtle reward for hours of work. While the meal simmers, you attend to minor domestic repairs, scrubbing pots, mending a torn cloth, or inspecting utensils for cracks. The repetitive motions are almost meditative, allowing your mind to wander gently across the day's events. You recall the morning in the fields, the hustle of the market, the satisfaction of repaired fences and stacked firewood. Each memory is threaded with sensory detail: the smell of tilled soil, the sound of carts on cobblestones, the warmth of a fire on your shoulders. Fringe sources suggest that maintaining such detailed awareness of daily tasks and surroundings was a form of practical mindfulness. Though historians still debate whether peasants were consciously reflective or simply attuned out of necessity, you recognize both elements at work. As twilight deepens, neighbors drift closer to the village center, finishing their own chores and exchanging brief stories, small jokes, or warnings about weather and livestock. You pause to nod at a passing acquaintance, noting the subtle social cues: a tilt of the head, a smile, a brief comment about today's harvest. These small interactions, seemingly trivial, reinforce communal bonds, creating a tapestry of shared responsibility and gentle oversight. Fringe tales suggest that evening gatherings sometimes included whispered charms or secret blessings, reinforcing protection and luck, though whether these were widely practiced or lightly symbolic is uncertain. You step outside briefly to check on animals, their low murmurs and occasional bleats blending with the evening chorus. Goats and chickens move lazily now, settling near fences or in sheltered areas, and the scent of hay and manure mingles pleasantly with the cooling air. Historians still argue whether peasants were vigilant guardians or largely tolerant of minor chaos in their livestock. But your own careful observation suggests a balance, allowing animals space to roam while ensuring they remain secure. Fringe accounts claim that some villagers whispered to animals at dusk, believing that words spoken at the day's end ensured health or obedience. You indulge a soft good evening to the goats, amused but comforted by the ritual. Returning to the hut, you tend the hearth, adjusting logs so that flames burn steadily without overwhelming the small space. Smoke curls lazily upward, filling the room with the familiar temps of burning wood. Fringe accounts suggest that placing small herbs on embers could ward off illness or attract favorable spirits. Whether true or not, you scatter a sprig of rosemary and watch it sizzle, the fragrance mingling with that of the stew. Historians still debate whether such practices were common or exceptional. But in the quiet of the evening, the act feels like a gentle extension of domestic labor into ritual, blending utility with symbolic comfort. The evening meal itself is simple but nourishing: a modest bowl of vegetable stew, chunks of bread, and perhaps a small portion of cheese or salted meat if luck has favored the household. You sit cross-legged on the floor or at a low table, savoring the warmth, texture, and flavor of sustenance earned through hours of labor. Conversation is soft, punctuated by laughter or the occasional anecdote about the day's oddities: a chicken that laid an unusually small egg, a neighbor tripping over a log, or a goat testing the resilience of a newly repaired fence. Fringe stories suggest these shared tales reinforced communal memory and subtle moral lessons, though historians still argue whether they were primarily entertainment or social instruction. Either way, the narrative thread is comforting, connecting each participant to both the village and tradition. As the sun slips further below the horizon, the light in the hut softens to a muted glow, shadows lengthening and blending with the fire's warmth. You finish clearing dishes, stacking pots, and preparing small stores of food or grain for the night. The domestic cadence continues, slower now, with movements measured and deliberate, carrying the gentle satisfaction of work done. Fringe accounts suggest that certain nightly routines covering bread, extinguishing embers, or setting out small charms were believed to protect the household while inhabitants slept. Whether these rituals held practical significance or symbolic reassurance, they punctuate the day with intentionality, a gentle closing of labor's circle. Finally, you pause to rest, listening to the faint chorus of night insects, the soft rustle of leaves in a cooling breeze, and the distant sounds of neighbors settling for the night. The village feels alive, yet calm, a living organism pulsing with cycles of work, observation, and small amusement. Historians still debate the degree of leisure peasants truly enjoyed in evenings. But the blend of reflection, domestic care, and minor social engagement suggests moments of quiet contentment amid labor's demands. You exhale slowly, aware of the day's cumulative effort and the subtle pleasures embedded in routine, ritual, and sensory awareness. As darkness deepens, the hut becomes a cocoon of warmth, light, and lingering aromas. You notice the familiar patterns, the flicker of firelight on walls, the gentle hum of distant voices, and the occasional movement of animals settling in for the night. Even in exhaustion, there is a sense of mastery and belonging control over the small domain you inhabit. Understanding of your environment and connection to community through shared experience, ritual, and attention to both practical and whimsical details. The last light of dusk fades, leaving the village wrapped in shadows and the soft glow of hearth fires. You settle near the warmth of your own, easing tired muscles against the hard wooden bench. Outside, the chatter of neighbors softens, replaced by the low chorus of crickets, the distant barking of dogs, and the occasional creak of wood as houses adjust to cooling night air. This is the time when stories breathe, when words carry further than work, and when the oral traditions of centuries find their voice. You lean closer to the fire, the flames casting patterns against the walls, and listen as an elder begins recounting a tale of long winters and unexpected miracles. The cadence is slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. Historians still argue whether peasants crafted these tales anew with each generation or merely repeated what they had inherited. But in practice, the stories feel alive, evolving with each telling. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers swore stories themselves had power, shaping events to come, like charms spun in narrative form. You wonder if tonight's words will ripple outward, altering the threads of tomorrow. Children sit cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed, their attention fixed on every detail. Adults, weary from their day's labors, relax into the rhythm, occasionally interjecting with laughter, groans, or sly corrections. Someone offers a cup of weak ale, its earthy bitterness grounding you as the story arcs upward. The elder speaks of a knight who disappeared beneath a hill, only to re-emerge after 100 years, confused by the new fashions of boots and cloaks. The room chuckles, a sly aside follows, and some of you think the steward will ever fix that roof faster than 100 years. The laughter bursts, brief but genuine, dissolving the day's fatigue into shared warmth. Between stories, you hear music, simple, rustic, but enchanting. A neighbor plucks strings on a lute with calloused fingers, producing melodies both tender and raw. Fringe tales suggest peasants believed music after dark soothed wandering spirits or encouraged fertility of crops. Whether superstition or whimsy, the sound creates a cocoon of familiarity, as though the night itself leans in to listen. Historians still debate whether peasants themselves played these instruments widely or relied on passing minstrels, but in the present, the music feels as integral as bread or fire. The fire cracks sharply, sending sparks upward, briefly illuminating the ceiling beams. Shadows dance across walls, reshaping the hut into something mythic, almost theatrical. You realize how little is needed to transform a simple space. A voice, a melody, flickering light, and a shared audience. Stories range from religious parables to local gossip to half-remembered sagas of kings and battles. One tale speaks of a cow so clever it escaped 3 markets in a row, living on scraps from villagers too amused to catch it. Another claims that a bishop once forgot his sermon, so he improvised about the dangers of eating too much cabbage. 3 jokes peppered the storytelling tonight, each met with groans and chuckles in equal measure. Oral culture thrives, not just in the content of stories, but in their delivery. A well-timed pause, a raised eyebrow, or a sudden shout makes children jump and adults laugh. Fringe sources suggest some storytellers even developed reputations, traveling between villages like unofficial bards. Historians still argue whether these figures were common peasants with flair or professional wanderers, but their legacy remains in how the spoken word bridges time, teaching, and entertaining in equal measure. You note how much of history survives, not in ink or parchment, but in breath and memory. As the night deepens, conversation shifts from storytelling to reflection. Villagers trade observations, how the weather might change, whether the steward's tax demands will increase, or if the mill's wheel is grinding unevenly again. Each exchange, while practical, carries a subtle rhythm of humor and solidarity. Someone quips, "If the miller charged us for laughter, we'd all be broke." The group chuckles, releasing tension. Historians still debate whether humor softened the sharp edges of peasant hardship or masked deeper discontent. But in this moment, levity binds the group tighter than grievance. Children begin to nod, their heads drooping against parents' shoulders. You notice the gentle tenderness with which they are shifted onto straw mats. Covered with worn blankets, their dreams beginning just as stories fade. Fringe accounts whisper that whispering prayers into a child's ear as they drift to sleep protects them from nightmares. You murmur something soft to yourself, not from fear of spirits, but from the natural impulse to wrap words around those you care for. The atmosphere grows quieter, with only a few voices lingering in subdued tones. A young neighbor hums a tune absent-mindedly, a melody picked up from a minstrel weeks ago. The repetition, gentle and constant, weaves into the night like a thread holding the group together. You notice how repetition itself functions as memory. The more you hear the same tune or story, the more it belongs to you. Historians still argue whether peasants truly valued originality in storytelling or preferred the comfort of familiar patterns. But the smiles suggest both novelty and nostalgia are equally welcome. Eventually, as the embers dim, the circle disperses. One by one, neighbors retreat to their huts, voices growing fainter with distance. You remain briefly, staring into the fire's glow, savoring the echoes of laughter, music, and narrative that still linger in the air. The weight of the day presses into your limbs, but the warmth of shared memory lightens the fatigue. Fringe tales suggest that listening to stories late into the night could influence dreams, guiding the subconscious like a shepherd with sheep. You wonder what images will shape your own sleeper. Perhaps the clever cow, the forgetful bishop, or the knight blinking in confusion after his century-long nap. The village quiets, the night air cooling, carrying faint mist across fields. You retreat into your own small space, rolling onto straw and pulling a rough blanket over your shoulders. The fire crackles one last time, punctuating the night's rhythm. You close your eyes, the day's labor, meals, repairs, rituals, and stories settling into memory like carefully stacked firewood. Historians still debate whether peasants felt contentment in such lives or simply endured them. But you sense that meaning is woven into these small rituals and shared words, enough to make survival feel not just necessary but profoundly human. The night deepens, pressing its quiet weight upon the village, and yet the world does not entirely fall asleep. Even as your breathing slows and dreams begin to pull at the edges of your thoughts, life continues in subtle currents. The hearth embers fade to a soft orange glow, yet outside, the restless chorus of crickets hums on. Somewhere across the fields, an owl gives its slow, haunting cry. And the dogs stir half alert, their low growls rising and subsiding with the shifting wind. You realize that the peasant night is not absolute silence, but a tapestry of hushed sound woven between the rhythms of human rest and nature's persistence. Though most villagers now sleep, not all succumb to slumber at the same time. Someone tends to a newborn, rocking and whispering softly, while another rises to feed a restless goat. A handful of neighbors lie awake, staring into the dark, their minds filled with worries of weather, harvest, or unpaid dues. Historians still debate how common insomnia was among peasants, but fringe accounts suggest that broken sleep was expected, even normal. People often woke in the middle of the night, rising to check fires, tend animals, or even exchange quiet conversations before drifting back to bed. This first sleep and second sleep pattern has been argued over by scholars, with some claiming it was the natural rhythm of pre-industrial life. You turn on your side, shifting against the rough straw, and find yourself listening once again to the world around you. The creak of beams overhead, the distant shuffle of livestock, and the faint murmur of voices from a neighboring hot stall blend into an intimate soundscape. There is comfort in knowing you are not alone in wakefulness. It is as if the village itself breathes collectively, each household a lung inhaling and exhaling against the great darkness. In some households, night becomes a time for whispered prayers. You imagine families murmuring invocations not just for protection, but to fill the emptiness of night with meaning. A mother might ask for health, a father for strength, a child for dreams free of terrors. Historians still argue whether such prayers were more heartfelt devotion or routine superstition. But fringe accounts suggest peasants believed the night was spiritually porous, a time when unseen forces lingered closer, listening. That belief alone gave shape to nightly words, turning silence into dialogue with the invisible. Some villagers even used the night for more than prayer. Stories tell of charms prepared after dark, herbs hung in doorways, knots tied into cloth for protection, bowls of water left beneath windows to reflect away malevolent spirits. You consider whether these were true practices or exaggerations preserved in folklore. But either way, they speak to the same instinct, the need to secure the fragile hours between dusk and dawn. In the glow of memory, you can almost see a figure standing quietly in a doorway, knotting twine with deliberate hands, eyes fixed on the moonlight. Night also held space for quiet intimacy. Couples might whisper softly, sharing thoughts too tender or too weary for the bustle of daylight. Some found comfort in closeness, while others lay apart, exhausted by labor and worry. Historians still debate how affection expressed itself in peasant homes, whether warmth or duty dominated marriages. Yet the stillness of night, the long pauses between noises, seems to invite confessions or silences that carry their own meanings. You think of the gentle rhythm of two bodies sharing breath in the dark, not needing words at all. In the barns and pens, animals to surrender to their nocturnal rhythms. Cows shuffle softly, goats bleat faintly, pigs snort and sigh in straw. Occasionally, a horse stamps, shaking off insects even in the cool dark. Fringe accounts whisper that peasants believed certain animals were more restless during nights of elopement, as though they sensed what humans could not. Whether superstition or observation, the idea makes you glance inward, wondering whether unease in your chest is merely thought or something older, instinctive. You rise briefly, slipping outside into the cool air. The village is cloaked in stillness, only the faint glow of a few embers visible through cracks in shutters. Above, the sky stretches vast and endless, scattered with stars. You tip your head back, eyes searching constellations. Some are familiar, tied to tales you've heard since childhood: bears, hunters, plows, while others remain nameless. Glittering mysteries. Historians still argue how deeply peasants engaged with astronomy, but fringe accounts suggest that the night sky served as both calendar and scripture. A certain star rising at dawn might signal planting, another foretell harvest. Tonight, the constellations seem less like guides and more like silent companions, keeping watch over those who sleep below. Your breath fogs faintly in the chill, and you notice the way the air carries scents absent during the day. The smoke of hearths lingers lower, mingling with the earthy dampness of soil and the faint musk of animals. Somewhere nearby, wildflowers release subtle fragrance, sharper now than under the sun. Even the smell of wood, the beams of houses, the fences, the barn walls seems more pronounced at night, as though the village itself exhales in darkness. You return inside, stirring the embers with a stick, coaxing a small flame back to life before lying down again. The warmth comforts you, and your mind drifts toward half-dreams. You think of stories told earlier, cows, bishops, knights, and imagine them wandering into your slumber. Perhaps you'll see the clever cow grazing in a meadow of stars, or the forgetful bishop fumbling through a sermon to owls. Historians still debate whether dreams were considered divine messages or mere illusions. But fringe tales suggest that peasants sometimes carried their dreams into daylight, treating them as warnings, omens, or advice from unseen realms. You wonder what you might remember when dawn arrives. Time drifts strangely in the dark. You wake again, unsure if moments or hours have passed. Outside, the sounds shift, the crickets quieter, the roosters beginning tentative calls, dogs stretching and shaking off sleep. You realize that the village is already stirring, though the horizon still clings to darkness. This is the in-between hour, neither fully night nor yet day, when shadows blur and the world feels both fragile and eternal. Some neighbors rise early to tend animals before the light. You hear buckets carried, gates creaking, low murmurs of encouragement to sleepy livestock. Others rise to knead bread, the scent of yeast and flour faint but promising. Historians still argue whether waking before dawn was duty or habit. But fringe accounts insist peasants often used these liminal hours for small personal rituals, mending, praying, or even slipping outside alone to watch the sky. The hour is theirs, stolen back from the demands of daylight. You lie still, listening, your body reluctant, yet aware that soon you too will rise. The thought of another day of toil weighs upon you, but not with dread, rather, with the inevitability of seasons themselves. Each day repeats, yet each feels subtly new. Weather shifts, conversations alter, stories change their inflection. The night has refreshed you, not only through sleep, but through the quiet reminder that life is more than labor. It is also the hush of whispered prayers, the echo of laughter by firelight, the stars that stretch endlessly above. As the first pale streaks of dawn touch the sky, you know this cycle will continue. Day, dusk, story, sleep, night, dawn. Historians still debate whether peasants felt trapped by this rhythm or comforted by its constancy. You sense the answer lies in both. For what is life but a circle of breaths, each one echoing the last, each one leading into the next? And what is night but the tender pause in between, reminding you that even in darkness, there is always continuity, always another morning waiting. The roosters call louder now, clear and insistent. The world shifts from night to day, from silence to sound. You take a deep breath, rise from your straw bed, and prepare to step once more into the long, enduring cycle of the peasant's life. The night lingers softly now, thinning like a veil as your thoughts drift slower and slower. You've walked through a peasant's day from first light to final silence. And though the labors were heavy, the quiet patterns of life leave behind a strangely calming rhythm. You can almost feel the straw beneath you, smell the fading smoke of the hearth, and hear the gentle murmur of neighbors slipping into their own fragile dreams. Your breathing deepens, steady, unhurried. The endless lists of chores, the chatter of the market, the toll of bells, they all dissolve into a faint, hazy backdrop. What remains is only a sense of stillness, of belonging to something simple and vast. The peasants may have worried about storms or taxes, but in the silence of night, worries lose their sharp edges, becoming like shadows that pass across the wall before vanishing into darkness. Outside, the wind runs softly through the trees, bending branches with a whisper rather than a shout. The stars, constant and patient, hang quietly in their watch. And you, lying as though within the circle of that same sky, are wrapped in the same peace that has comforted countless lives before you. Each breath carries you further away from thought, closer to the hush of sleep. Your body grows heavy, your mind lighter, as though floating on the surface of a wide, calm river. You are safe here, in this moment suspended between waking and dreaming. Tomorrow may come with its noise and its labor, but for now there is only rest. Close your eyes fully now, let the quiet of the medieval village fade into your own quiet, and drift gently, slowly, peacefully into sleep.